you.
Sorry, I should have started that before. There we go.
First of all, a word of thanks to all of you who have been part of this study. I have been listening a little to Robin before we all got on, and I'll make a few comments that will give you a little backstory and may open some doors for conversation. Most of all, I want to listen and respond to the questions that you have, or statements, stories that you may want to tell out of your own experience. Some of this may actually be in the book. I was kind of kidding with Robin. You all have read the book more recently than I have. I looked back through it today to, reconnect with some of the ideas. But Paul Chilcote and I have actually known each other since 1977. I went to Duke University to do my PhD study in Wesleyan studies. And Paul and Janet, fairly newlyweds, were already there working in the Master of Divinity degrees in the Divinity School. And that's all in the same building. So it was easy for us to find each other. And when we did, we struck up an immediate friendship that has lasted all these years. I was going to say, if any of you tune in, tomorrow at Tuesday, it would not surprise me at all if you will hear Paul say things and think to yourself, well, Steve said that last night. And that's partly because our friendship is so long and deep and wide that we really do think alike in a lot of ways. One of the surprises about the book that I don't think we say it, is that each of us wrote 2 chapters. But one of the compliments at Abingdon, the editor, was we couldn't tell which you wrote which chapter. It all seemed like it was written by one person. There was a little tidying up here and there, but generally speaking, we wrote, of course, we passed the chapters back to each other and tweaked them. But generally speaking, we wrote without knowing what the other one was going to be writing about. And that's always a little bit of a concern to an editor, that it's going to seem like, 2 books that didn't fit together, but it didn't turn out to be that way. So I forget whether I did chapter 1 and 3 and he did 2 and 4, but it was something like that. Now, a little bit about why the book. And this is in the introduction, I think. Each of us, we knew we were doing it, but as it turned out, each of us wrote a book in 2019. Paul wrote a book called Active Faith, and I wrote a book called Holy Love. And we kind of chuckled a little because, Paul says, now abideth these 3, faith, hope, and love. And we realized that we'd covered 2 of those bases, but we'd left hope hanging out there by itself. And that gave rise to 2 things. First, Paul and I have always wanted to co-author a book. For years, we've said, one of these days we've got to write a book together. And so here we were with Paul's faith book and my love book and a hope book, just kind of waiting to be written. And we thought, well, maybe this is the time for us to, to collaborate and do something we've talked about doing for a long time. The other thing was, though, as you'll remember, this was about the time that the pandemic was beginning to break open on the world. And even within that, there was the growing challenges in the United Methodist Church, which was leaving a lot of people wondering where hope was to be found so far as the future of our denomination. And in the larger society too, as Christian nationalism has increasingly taken over. That's really one of the chapters in Paul's book on faith, is that how Christian nationalism has just overtaken Christianity when it's not really nationalistic or Christian. It's just kind of bogus in both ways. So he writes about that. But it's hope has been in short supply, hasn't it? You all may have talked about that as you studied the book. I'm not going to say much more, except to say that that opportunity to write a third book to complete the trilogy of Faith, Hope, and Love, the opportunity to write a book together, which we'd always wanted to do, and the opportunity to speak to a need, the need for hope in a time when it's in short supply. All of those things came together, and we wrote very quickly, so that within a year later, 2020, Living Hope was not only written, but it was published. So groups like yours, individuals have read it. I think we're up to 12 or 13 people now that have read the book total. Really exciting. So you all, I'm joking. It's not a huge number, but we have gotten some good feedback. Now, what about tonight? The only thing that I want to say is any questions are fair questions, because I have no idea what the Spirit of God may have done in your mind or in your heart while you were reading this book. If there is a question that pertains specifically to a page or a paragraph, identify it so that I can, get on the same page with you. This may not be something that I've thought about, today myself. So if you say on page 79, I just didn't quite get what you were driving at. On the other hand, you may just have some big takeaway questions that don't, directly relate to anything in the book, and that's okay too. So we'll just throw it open in that way, and I look forward to hearing what you have to share, having studied it.
Great. Anne has a question.
There's Anne and Marty both, two hands coming right up there.
They're sisters, just for your information.
Well, hi there.
I'm the younger one.
Okay, all right.
No, I was just thinking about when the two of you decided to write this book. Did you kind of come up with titles for the chapters and decide which one of you was going to write on this, or it was just totally open? I'll write a couple of chapters, you write a couple of chapters.
No, it wasn't. Yeah, I probably tried to keep it too simple and didn't want to go into huge detail. No, we sort of outlined the book that, the chapters were not, didn't come by way of surprise. We met for coffee and we talked, is this a time for us to co-author a book, and would a book on hope not only fill in the third book in the series, but would it be something we'd enjoy doing together? So when we said yes to all that, then I'm going to look myself the table of contents here very quickly, if you don't mind. And we wanted to begin with a pretty large witness to hope from the biblical revelation, and then to look back on kind of the legacy of hope that we inherit today. That's chapter 2. And then we wanted to say, so do we have reason? Do we have a reason to be hopeful today? That's kind of chapter 3. And then chapter 4 is, so if we do have a reason to be hopeful, what are some of the practices that can help us cultivate hope in ourselves, in others, in our communities? So yeah, we sort of knew what the chapters were going to be. As I recall, and it's been nearly 3 years ago, I think we picked the two that we were most interested in, and it turned out that it came out pretty nicely. So that, I don't even remember now myself which two I wrote and which two Paul wrote out.
Thank you.
What I actually remember more is the editor saying, well, these books that are co-authored, they often look like they're kind of chopped up and put back together again. And we said, well, we'll just give it a shot, and if we can't do it, then you don't publish it. But he wrote back and he said, this is amazing. I can't tell who wrote what.
That's great. Wonderful.
Yeah,
Marty had a question, and then Judy will go to you.
There she is. Hi, Marty.
Okay, I was a counselor for many years in the schools. And one of the things that troubled me was that there were so many students who really were not connected to their families. Their families had a couple of jobs. They would eat at the corner store. There was never any sitting down for a meal. And they really didn't feel like they belonged. And we just sang a song about that in church this Sunday about people being lost and that they needed God and they needed the Lord, and we needed to help them find the Lord. And,
Yeah.
that's pretty tough to do in school settings because you're not allowed to discuss religion. You're able to encourage students, you're able to try to give them a sense of belonging, but there's so many that are just lost.
Yes, that's true. Do you want me just to move into that with a response, or
Yes.
was there a particular question that you wanted me to try to address about it?
Well, I wanted you to dig into that in terms of how to provide hope for those students.
Okay, how to provide hope. Well, first of all, I'm not sure at 75 years of age that I understand the students as well as you came to understand them, being a school counselor day after day after day. But here's what I do know. About 20% of our population today fall into that category called nuns and duns. They're either people who have had no affiliation with an established religion, or those who have had but have been disillusioned or harmed in some way, and they've left the church or left some other religion. It's not just Christianity. So the great irony, I think, Marty, is that we have a lost generation of young people that you've just described. But in too many places, the church itself has not appeared to be a place for them to go. We've appeared to be too negative, judgmental, legalistic. We have not been as welcoming and hospitable, so that you've almost got a problem on both sides. You've got this lost generation in the middle who can't go home on the one hand because there's no home really to go to, and they don't feel like they can go to church. So I think that's a huge problem. The only thing that I would say, and it's really coming out of an old guy whose time is kind of come and gone on this. I think the future of the church for all people, but let's keep it focused on 18 to 35, say, 18 to 25, whatever it would be. I think the future of the church is outside the walls of the church more than inside the walls. I think we're going to have to try and figure out where they are going and show up there. And I'm not even prepared to know how to have conversations when you get there. There are people in the United Methodist Church who do that. Michael Beck is a friend of mine. He works at the Discipleship Ministries, and one of the things he's doing is trying to reach this lost generation. So Michael's talking about a distributed church. He pastors one church here in Florida, but he has 13 congregations. One meets in a park, one meets in a bowling alley, one meets at a yoga studio, one meets at a tattoo parlor, one meets at a bar and grill, and they have not waited for the lost generation to find the church. They have been proactive to find the lost generation. And so, by the way, this is interesting because, it's us institutional types. When Michael does his weekly report at the annual conference, how many people did you have in church this week? He adds them all 13 up. He doesn't add just the ones that came to the building at 11 o'clock on Sunday. Said, we had 17 in the building and we had 123 others. And that's what he's finding. He's finding that the older generation and some of the people like to come to the church, but the younger generation likes the church to come to them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Judy, you had a question, and then Bill. You're muted, Judy.
Let's see, I'm looking
Sorry.
for Judy.
There are a
There
number of
she
things
is.
that are running around my mind since you started talking. I First of all, you write so much like your partner. Were you in classes together in seminary, or you just talked a lot yourself, or how did you all come to kind of the same line of thought?
Well, you know, that's been so long ago, I can't really answer that question as well as I could have probably at the time. Jeannie and I had been married for 7 years. We married in 1970. Paul and Janet had been married less than that. I think they'd been married maybe 3. And so we both got to Duke. Paul and Janet actually got there a year before us, I think. And we were both just interested in finding social contacts as much as student contacts. I don't remember, Paul may remember, I don't recall us having a class together. We might have. Most of our
I'm sorry,
friendship.
seminary? Was that in
I'm
seminary?
sorry.
Where did you meet?
Paul
Duke.
was at Duke. Paul was at Duke Divinity School, and I was at Duke University in the PhD program. But we met in the same building.
Okay.
So it was easy to see people every day if you wanted to see them. Another thing that Paul and I did is we played table tennis together during lunch hours. And we actually entered a table tennis tournament at Duke University, and our wives made us 2 T-shirts. Mine said King of Ping, and Paul said Kong of Pong, so that we were the King Kong of Ping Pong.
Wonderful.
We had hoped that those T-shirts would buy us some points in an actual game, but when we were playing students from Asia, the T-shirts didn't amount to very much, actually. All of those are just the ways you make friends. Jeannie and Janet made their deep friendship as spouses, so that by the time we'd been there for 3 years and we moved on, and Paul stayed on to do his PhD, which he had not originally planned to do. But after we'd overlapped for 3 years, we realized that we had a friendship that we needed to maintain over the years.
Okay, what was your PhD in?
My PhD, yes, my PhD is in historical theology with a specialization in Wesley studies.
Okay, okay.
Yep.
Now, your opening comments, you mentioned something about Christian nationality.
Christian
Nationalism.
nationalism. Christian nationalism.
What is that?
Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism. What I would really tell you to do to try to keep this simple is to Google that and go from there. And I'm not trying to avoid your question. It's just that Christian nationalism has been a growing phenomenon in the United States since about the late 70s or early 80s. You may remember Moral Majority and George Orwell and some of those people back in that day. That movement has continued to grow, and it's now become extremely political.
Okay.
So that some people believe that there's really only one party that represents God nowadays, and that if you vote for candidates in the other party, you are part of the Antichrist rather than Christian. It's a very evil thing, Judy. And I'm not.
Well,
I'm
our
not,
separation of church and state, I will look that up to see. Thank you.
Yeah, I would Google Christian nationalism. There's a book by Jeff Shallet, Schallet, and I could be off on the spelling. That's close. You can find it. Jeff Shallet, SCH or SH. If anybody's looking, help me out. His book is simply called The Family, and it's a rather chilling account of how all this got started and got wrapped up in the political sphere in Washington, D.C. several decades ago. If you ever see Jesus, I'm thinking about one of the MAGA rallies lately where there's a portrait of Jesus and he's wearing a MAGA cap and carrying a flag. That's a manifestation of what the Christian nationalists are up to. They are trying to convince the rest of us that their way of faith is the way of the nation. And you can obviously tell that I don't, agree with that, but nevertheless.
Thank you. Thank you very much. My time's up.
No, that's fine.
That's good. Thank you. Bill, you had a question?
Yes.
Hi, Bill.
In the world today, there are many problems, but one of the main problems today, as I see it, is Ukraine.
Is what
Ukraine
now?
people, the Ukraine people.
Yeah.
And I would like to know how you address hope to those people today. They're going through a very difficult period of time. It seems to me like there's a lot of inevitable things that are going to happen. Their land is being destroyed.
Yeah.
Even though there's some certain things about that's happening right now with some of the war that there seem to be winning in certain areas. It seems to me that a lot of the institutions, the apparatus of their just their whole apparatus of their whole economy is being destroyed piece by piece. How do you address hope to them?
Well, one of the things, if you knew me better, is I try not to give answers that I don't really have. I've not been in Ukraine. I mean, I watched the news tonight before joining you all by Zoom, and part of that, of course, dealing with Ukraine. But I also watched a tragic unfolding of history right now in Somalia, where the climate change and the drought are taking people who just a few years ago were prosperous farmers and now they're destitute. I'm going to give you the most honest answer I can give, okay? And that is, I have to be very careful in my North American white privilege bubble, which I've lived in all my life, actually. Middle class entitlement, where I've never really wanted for anything. And we didn't have a lot of things compared to the wealth of the world, but I can't remember one day that I went without food, clothing, shelter, or even toys. So, Bill, I fall back to my generation, which of course I was, how old was I? 47. I was 16, 17, 18 during the Civil Rights Movement with Martin Luther King Jr., John Lewis. And I've gone back to source as well as some others. John Deere is a contemporary nonviolent activist writer, William Barber. One of the things that they teach is that you don't define hope by circumstance. You define hope by trajectory. And there's a statement by Mr. Rogers, who I don't often quote, even though I think pretty highly of the man, actually. He said when he was a young man, he was facing a difficult situation, and his mother said to him, you can always find good people in any situation. Always look for the helpers. So I would say, I would say in a very, very, very tentative way, that if we could move out of the news media that shows the bombed out buildings and the lives that have been unnecessarily taken by bombs and bullets and starvation, if we could just shift off that scene, we would probably find people who are helping and caring and giving. The World Central Kitchen, for example, I don't know if you're familiar with that ministry or not. The World Central Kitchen has served hundreds of thousands of meals in Ukraine. So my response is not that I know how to bring hope to people who are in those situations, because I don't. I've never lived in that situation. What I would say though is, if we could just shift off camera, away from the devastation, we would find people on the ground loving, caring, serving, helping. And those are little signs of hope. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, always look for the light, even if it's only a candle's worth of light. And that's about the best I can do to respond to your question, because I've never come close to the suffering that those people are going through.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jim, looks like you have a question. And then Ann again.
That Nancy and Jim?
That's
Yes.
Nancy and
yes,
Jim,
yes.
yes.
I see you, Jim. I see you.
All right, I'll get more than that. I was wondering what gives you hope in the midst of this crisis in the United Methodist Church, along the lines of division, where, what gives you hope about that situation?
That's a question I've been asked before, and I don't mean that I've got a canned answer. It just means that I do have hope. I'm going to keep my response limited to that part of the United Methodist Church that will stay United Methodist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how persons in the Wesleyan Covenant Association or the Global Methodist Church would answer that question, because that's a question you could say to them, what are you hopeful about as you start a new denomination? I'm sure they would have some responses. My response, Jim, and maybe this is where my Wesleyan history comes through. And again, I'll just be as frank and honest as I can be. Except for the differences that we have over issues like human sexuality, there's no reason to leave the United Methodist Church. Now, that doesn't mean it's a perfect church. I'm not saying that. It's got all kinds of problems. But when you look at our book of discipline and see what our theological statement is, when you see what our position on scripture is, now, some of the folks in the Global Methodist Church are trying to say, well, we were leaving the United Methodist Church because you all don't believe in the divinity of Christ or the resurrection, the authority of scripture. And what I say to that is, in a group of 8 million people, you're going to find some wild cards who believe all sorts of things. You don't pass judgment on a denomination by the last individual you met. You evaluate a denomination by what its witness is. And our witness has been and continues to be biblical Christianity, the creeds of the church. We've not defaulted on those. I'm not saying that to try to convince you. I'm just trying to tell you how I respond. There's no reason to leave, because we have not left those, despite the fact that some of the folks on the other side are creating the impression that we have. The fact is, we haven't.
I would totally agree.
If we ever change the book of discipline and do away with some of the historic doctrines and creeds, then that's another conversation. But we haven't done that. And I don't think you all at Lakewood have done that either. I got to know Lakewood a little bit when Rebecca Chilcote became a member there. And of course, Paul Chilcote, who will be on tomorrow, is familiar with the church more than I am. I don't see any reason why anybody should leave the church and go with a new denomination. What have you all done that you shouldn't have done, would be my question.
Right.
You've stayed the course. You've stayed the course.
Thank you, Steve.
So you asked me what's hopeful. What's hopeful is that I'm standing on a foundation of faith that goes back to the Wesleys, that goes back to 1743. This is not an upstart thing. This is not something that just came out of the box yesterday. This is an historical faith that's been alive and moving for nearly 300 years. That means something to me.
Me too. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Amen. Great. And I think, is there anybody else who had a question? Anne, I know you have another question, so go for it.
So we were, before these last question or two, we were talking about the lost generation and where people are going to church. And I'm just curious where you live, if you're seeing the same thing that we have seen in the western suburbs of Cleveland, where I don't know who, but someone starts up a church service in the Lakewood High School. Or I hear there's also one in the Rocky River High School, and there are people out on the streets and welcoming people, and there's all sorts of cars there. Everybody's going to this, but it isn't a church at all. And I don't know what it is that they are, if they are sharing some faith. Are they any denomination, or they're just a group of people that want to meet on Sunday morning and act as if they're in church? I'm a little puzzled by it all.
Well, I've reached the point where I don't know how my response is, how generationally conditioned they are, because I'm 75. I'm not 45 or 35 or 25. What I do think I observe, though, is that we're living today in a very independent culture. For example, just this most recent election, we went into that election knowing there were more independents than there were Republicans or Democrats. So the person that was going to win the election was going to be the person who could persuade the independents in their direction. That's because you've got the Republicans on one side, you've got the Democrats on the other, and this huge swath of people in this country who are not affiliated with any political party, and so they vote independently. There's an independent spirit in our land today that leads people to believe that if they can simply get together and do something that's meaningful for them, that's all they need to do. Now, in the Wesleyan tradition, we don't define church that way. We define church locally as a group that meets together, but we also understand that we're connected with Christians all around the world. We understand that we are part of a world communion. Church for us is a bigger word than for the person who meets at a high school. Now, I don't have any right to judge the correctness or the quality of what's happening at the high school. I'd have to go there for 6, 8, 10 weeks. I'd have to meet people. I'd have to listen to sermons. I'd have to go to some Bible studies before I would be ready to decide whether or not they were Christian. But I can say earlier on that independent and Christian are two words that don't go together. Because even St. Paul said, you are individually members of the body of Christ. See, individual members of a larger body. So if I were a consultant to a high school church that meets there, I would say, who are you connected to? Who are you accountable to? Where is your faith larger than your group? Because we're in trouble in this country in all sorts of ways. We form our groups and turn them into little silos where we not only live independently of each other, but we cast aspersions on other people who aren't like us. I don't know whether they're doing that at the high school or in the small church, whatever it is, but I would want to know how they see church larger than themselves.
Thank you.
Anyone else have questions or comments about things that we read along the process? Christian, did I see your hand go up?
Yeah, it did. I was just curious, where your what drew your interest towards John Wesley and his brother. I don't know how that all started, but what was your immediate interest drawn to?
First of all, I think any seminarian is going to be exposed to the Wesleys and to Methodism enough, hopefully, to have some residual interest. You know, you don't just kind of graduate, forget about it. But I graduated from seminary in 1973. Now, if you will remember, that's a year after we began to start talking about the problems that's leading to the division now, the issue of human sexuality. We had merged with the Evangelical Brethren in 1968, 1972, and again in 1976. We were beginning already in our denomination to not see things. So here I was as a young pastor in a church in West Texas, and I realized that I needed, what shall I say? I needed some place to go other than my own opinions about things. So my interest in the Wesleys was the same kind of interest that I have when I want to try to get outside my own head. In other words, is Methodism something other than what I think it is, or been taught that it was? And if it is, I need to know what that is, the same way that I hope my doctor is staying in touch with good medicine, broadly conceived. Thinking, well, I like to give people yellow pills. Yellow pills usually work. And you go, well, hey, that's cool. Have you read up on yellow pills lately? I was kind of the same way with Methodism. You know, hey, I think Methodism's cool. I want to be a Methodist. I'd rather be a Methodist than a Baptist. And that just wasn't cutting it for me. And I felt like I had to do the homework. And that homework that I did from about 72 to 75, because 75 is when I went to Duke University to work on my PhD. That 3-year lead up was a decision. Well, it was really a call from God to invest myself in further education that I'd never planned on doing. That wasn't anywhere close to being on the map for me. But by 1975, again, 3 more years of United Methodism now, Good News Movement, all this kind of stuff. I realized, wow, we're in danger of not knowing what the center of Methodism is anymore, because we've got so many different voices trying to tell us what it is. So that's a quick answer. I mean, I hope it's a quick answer. Yeah. And then I've taught it. I started teaching in 1980. So what is that? 42 years ago. Yeah. I guess I just wondered if there was a center somewhere to Methodism, and what would it be if you found it?
Okay, thank you. Nancy. That's Nancy of Nancy and Jim.
Jim.
I think you said you wrote chapter 3.
I don't actually.
You're not sure? Okay.
Let's just
Well,
go for that.
I
Sounds
just
like
really
one I probably wish I would have written.
I just really liked it, chapter 3 on page 36, where you talked about hope as a life orientation. And
Yes.
I know so many people that I see hope in them no matter what happens, even in time of adversity. But then there's all these people that are always depressed and anxious, don't seem to have that life orientation. What difference? Why do you think some people have that as their life orientation where other people just don't seem to have it?
Well, I'm looking at page 36 to actually remember what's in there. I think what you're pointing to, that I'll jump to, is the difference between hope and optimism.
Okay.
Optimism can rise and fall with your circumstances. You can say, well, I don't have anything to be optimistic about because I don't know where my next meal's coming from. And that's sort of what
Mhm.
hurts in Ukraine. You know, I don't know whether the Ukrainians are optimistic in their circumstances, but Victor Havel, that I quote there, would say you can still be hopeful, partly because you're going to run into some people who are there to try to help you survive and get through it, but also because history, and I think this is true, history has a way of correcting itself over time. People keep crawling out on limbs. Maybe we saw a little bit of it in this last election when people were predicting a big red wave and it didn't quite, you know, people, we don't ever know what God is doing in other people's hearts. So we run onto these people who have gone through terrible times, disease, deprivation, loss of children to accidents or war or whatever. We had an acquaintance that wasn't a good friend. They had decorated their house to welcome their son home from Afghanistan. The balloons were up, the welcome home banners were there. He was killed the day he was to leave. Oh my God. And I don't say that as a curse word. I say he was killed on the day he was supposed to leave. Now, those people had to reach way down inside to find the strength, because they had to take all the balloons down and all of the crepe paper and the Victor Havel is saying, I think, what Jesus says, that these people who tend to live with hope have deep reservoirs to draw from when the rain is not coming. Now that doesn't mean that you can't run out of gas. It doesn't mean that you can't find that your well can run dry. Hope is not Pollyanna. Hope is not, oh, everything's fine when it's not fine. That's just pretending. But there do seem to be some people who have dug deep wells, and they can remain hopeful when other people are giving up. I don't know, to get back to Bill, because I'm seeing him on my screen. I don't know, but I can imagine that for some of the Ukrainians, President Zelensky is a sign of hope, because he simply will not give up. He just won't let the people believe that they're going to cease to be a country. He just keeps saying, we are going to get through this. We are going to get through this. Maybe that's what David was saying in the 23rd Psalm. Even when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for thou art with me. The word through is very important. I walk through the valley. I don't get stuck in the valley. I don't know if I'm responding to your question or not, but I think it comes more from the inside than it does the outside, because the circumstances can be crappy. They can be terrible. Yet we still know people who say, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this. It is well with my... Yeah.
Thank you. Looks like Becky has her hand raised.
I do. And I guess my question, Steve, is about, can you speak a little bit about what your thoughts are related to how hope is instilled to us from those around us, and your thoughts on that?
Oh, well, I would be surprised. I mean, now you've got to help me. I remember my own book, but I would just imagine there's somewhere in here then Paul and I wrote about the importance of community, formation of hope. If you can find it, I'm going to go, yeah, there it is.
I know, but I guess here's my, I mean, it is, but here's my question to you, and that is, I think about myself and how the hymns in church instill hope in me.
Okay, all right, yes, all
Pe-
right,
the people I hang around with instill hope in me.
yeah.
And so, you know, I know you're not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but you know, how much of an impact does that really have on people? That do you think? I mean, is it,
Okay.
can it bring somebody out of the deepest places that they're in by based on other people, or what have you seen?
I'm thinking, just so you all can return to this if you want to, I think chapter 4, the practice of hope, there's a lot of stuff in community there. There is hymnody, there is nature. I can honestly say to you, there have been probably more times than I can remember when I didn't get up on Sunday morning and want to go to church, but I went anyway and felt better for having gone. I could have stayed at home. I could have kept the fires of my pity party burning. But when I got with friends, when I got with other people, something was different. When we sang hymns, when we went to the Lord's Supper at the table, those communal acts, those relationships have an uplifting effect on the human spirit, I think. What's the old saying? A fool is the person who has only himself as a counselor.
Can you say that again?
A fool is the person who has only himself as a counselor. You know, if all you do is listen to your own voice and get inside your own head, you can spiral downward really easily. Sometimes all it may take is just your best friend saying, "Hey," you know, or just patting you on the back. Mother Teresa was once quoted as saying, when she said, how do you uplift people? She said, "I smile at them." So some days you go to church and somebody just smiles at you. Somebody just kind of acknowledges that you're alive. So I think, was it Judy? Is that who it was that was asking?
Becky.
Becky, all right. I think community, I think it's why when the New Testament defines church, it calls it a body and not just a believer. See, the church is the body of Christ. Okay, some days my head hurts, but my elbow's in pretty good shape. Someday my stomach hurts, but my hearing's still pretty good. I think about the parable of the man who could not get to Jesus, so 4 of his friends put him on a stretcher, picked him up, and carried him. Sometimes I have to be carried, and that can only happen in community. You can't carry yourself. You ever tried to pick yourself up? You can't do it. You've got to have somebody else to pick you up, and that happens when we're together, not when we're separated.
So true.
You talked about that on 78 and 79. Page 78 and 79, you talked
78 and 79. I'm just so glad some of you all have read this. Yeah, there it is. I see it. Yeah, that's right.
Do you know Robin gives us a test when we're done? Did you know that, Steve?
I'm sorry?
Did you know Robin gives us a test when we're done? It's a written test.
Well, I'm gonna leave the Zoom before that happens, because I'll make the lowest grade, I'm afraid.
If I may just offer something when you talk about community.
Yes.
As human beings, we are created in the image of God. And if we truly believe in a Trinitarian God is Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or Creator, Redeemer, Sustainer, that's God is in relationship. And we, as being people created in God's image, are meant to be in relationship. So God is a God of community. We are people of community.
I would totally agree with you, Robin. In fact, there was a time, even when I was a pastor, when somebody would say, "Can you tell me about the Trinity?" And I would say something like, "The Trinity is so mysterious, you can hardly even talk about it." And now, as I think about it, I think life is more Trinitarian than we understand it. Cynthia Bourgeault is an Episcopalian, Bourgeault, Bourgeault. She's written a book called The Law of Three.
Hmm.
And she starts with the Trinity as the ultimate manifestation of it. But then she goes on to show how there are other kinds of tripartite dynamics in life. One of the things I would want to say back to Becky and to anybody else is that since I've been retired, I spent so many years in classrooms and church buildings and behind desks and under fluorescent lights and air conditioning and heating units and buildings. I think part of the community that we're made for is the communion with nature. Now, I'm not necessarily a Walden Pond kind of guy. I'd probably die in 2 weeks if I actually went out on the Appalachian Trail by myself, you know. But I think we've gotten so accustomed to maybe even saying we need to be in communion with everyone, which I certainly agree with. But I think we need to be in communion with everything too. There's some days we have a nice backyard. I go out with a warm cup of coffee and I just watch the fish and the birds, look at the trees. And there's something that comes into me from nature, even if it's around. Some people do this with music. Some people do it with poetry. I want to think about community at Acts 17:28 sense. In God we live and move and have our being. And some days that's the relationship I have with my wife. And some days it's a relationship I have with a falcon flying across the sky. And in a strange sort of way, not only do I have that kind of pervasive community, people and things, but it's also the realization that even when I'm lonely, I'm not actually ever alone. I'm always in a world of some kind. I may have lost touch with it. I may not see it anymore, or hear it anymore, or feel it anymore, but I'm always in an environment that's larger than I am. And sometimes it's that larger world where I hope when I can't find it in myself.
Thank you. I know Bill had his hand up.
I just got a question on technology and sort of piggybacked on some of the things you said. Do you think online presentations are affecting the church at all?
Yeah, I think anything that's as large as technology is, and that's everything from what we're doing right here tonight to a church live streaming their services or their Bible study. I think you're going to just see a mixed bag, Bill. I've seen some technology that doesn't invite me into it, either because it's just so poorly done that you don't want to waste your time on it. I have seen some technology that I wouldn't call it a substitute church, but I certainly would call it a parallel church. It has all the markings of what is important. I'll just be honest with you, and of course, tonight is sort of a violation of what I'm about to say. I find that I can a relationship with people through technology when I already have met them and know them. It's harder for me to establish a relationship online. It's harder for me to form a friendship on a screen. But you and I, for example, had played golf for the last 25 years together. I wouldn't have any trouble at all being in a prayer group with you on a Zoom meeting because I know you. I know Bill. You come through the image. Now I look at another person who I'm just seeing their face or hearing their voice. I have to listen and participate at a different level. But when I'm on a meeting with people I know and have known for some time, I don't. I'll say it. I find that pretty okay. I also think there's something generational about this because my son is 50. He's 25 years younger than I am. And he says, Dad, I make friends online all the time. And I go, really? I can't really think of anybody I've made a deep, deep, deep friendship with just by dialing them up and on a Zoom call. But my son actually makes friends all over the world with people. So I think it's almost like, what did we grow up with? What were we accustomed to? One of the things I've noticed in the neighborhood, the kids don't go outside and play anymore. They're all inside on their devices and their games. I didn't even think I was with my friends until I was outside playing with them. I mean, if my friend Bill Perry had said, hey, let me call you up and let's just talk every day for an hour and a half, I'd have said, what's that? Let's ride our bikes together, Bill. I don't want to talk to you on the phone. I want to go across the street and play catch with you and throw a football. You know, I think my generation understands relationships as person to person in the same place at the same time. I'm not sure some of our younger people think that way about relationships. So my point is, I would like to offer church in whatever ways are attractive to the people I'm trying to reach. If I've got people who say, I'd love to see you on Sunday morning and us do a Bible study together, well, I'd say, well, heck, let's get going, man. You know, let's do it. But that's not the way I would normally think about going to a Bible study. I'd think about getting in the car and driving somewhere.
Thank you.
Is that
Thank you.
a little bit of a...
It looks like Marty has a question, and then we'll begin to wrap things up, I think. But Marty, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I really have enjoyed that quilt that is behind Steve. Really, I wonder if it's all the pieces and parts of his life.
No, it's the pieces and parts of my grandmother's life. Quilt is probably about 150 years old.
Wow.
It's one of the gifts that my grandmother gave to me. And the story that came with it at the time is that she was in a quilting bee with other young women. She was probably in her 20s. And they would get together and they would bring these pieces of material. They would bring this fabric from shirts and dresses. And, I mean, you know what quilting bees were. They just they brought these rags and pieces together and made quilts out of them. And so when we moved here, we had a wall that was needing something. And my wife, Jeannie, said, let's hang your grandmother's quilt. Interesting. A lot of people comment on that when I'm online. Yeah, that's my grandmother's quilt. I'm 75. It's got to have been, she died in close to 90, let's say. Yeah, it's got to be close to 150 years old. Yeah. Thanks for noticing. I appreciate it.
It's great. Anyone else have any questions for Steve or any final comments? Jim?
Well, I don't know if you've seen, for anybody that I had their email address, I looked on Amazon for the book that Steve talked about, and I sent you the link to it, the Holy, yeah, that one.
Yes, The Holy Trinity and the Law of Three, Discovering the Radical Truth at the Heart of Christianity by Cynthia Burgold.
Yeah.
And it's also in the chat there, so.
And I always have to say, and please don't take this, I mean, I recommended the book, so it's a recommendation, but you might be reading along and saying, do you think Steve believes that? I don't know whether I do or not. All I can tell you is that I read the book, and Cynthia Burgold helped me understand that we're in a web of relationships way more than we probably think that we are.
Well, I think you're right, and that's why, you know, there's this thing about reading as much as you can to find out different opinions and then sort it out with your pastor, with your other people
Yeah.
of faith, has been something that's worked for me, and I really enjoy it. So
I've read probably 3 or 4 of Cynthia's books. She has a ministry called Christogenesis. If you put Christo and then the book of Genesis, Christogenesis, she is incorporating science and faith in pretty interesting sorts of ways. Some of you probably know one of the things we're experiencing today, and I'm watching the talk we've gone over a little, is that we're learning from cosmology. We're learning from the sciences. We're learning at the DNA level, and we're learning at the James Webb Telescope level. We're learning things about life that we didn't know before we had microscopes or cameras that could go into outer space. And so Cynthia is a kind of person who just is fascinated with all that sort of stuff. And I enjoy reading her, even though sometimes I don't understand her. She can get complicated. But I need people in my life that stretch me, and Cynthia does that.
yeah, Francis Collins, who just retired as the head of the National Institute of Health, wrote a great book on, the fact that science actually proves there's a God. That these.
Well, I think so. Teilhard de Chardin, the Roman Catholic paleontologist, he's a priest and a paleontologist. He's the source that got Cynthia started in all of this. So she writes about Teilhard de Chardin a lot. He said, for example, love is at the core of the universe. And people said, well, how can love be at the core of the universe? And he said, because when you see life coming together. Life tries to beget life. That's like Ukraine. You've got death and devastation and destruction, but you've got good people showing up trying to help. See, war and evil and pain and suffering are what we see. But if you step back, people coming together to say, you can stay at my house tonight. You can eat at my table until you can rebuild your table. Something about life, the final word is a coming together more than a. And so I find writing Cynthia's and Teilhard de Chardin and Francis Collins and Neil deGrasse Tyson and a bunch of different people to be fascinating.
Thank you. It looks like Eleanor had a question.
Yeah, it's not so much as a question as a comment, dovetailing Becky and Bill's question on Ukraine. The people of Ukraine and the people of Poland were both dominated by the Soviet Union until that fell apart, and now Ukraine's under the domination of Russia. And I've had a up close and personal seat watching at least family go through the Soviet Union and its transition to more of a democracy in Poland. And I've also seen them having community with people across the border in the Ukraine, and which I think that it goes back and forth, and these people have had exposure, and the Ukraine can look to Poland, because I'm going to tell you that a great number of the people of Poland had hope, and it was all based in their faith. I even have some family over there who at one point their house burned down and they weren't allowed to rebuild the house. So the family lived in a cave for many years until they could finally get permission to rebuild their house. But they were always had faith. They always had hope for the future. And you can see the community across the border. They are close enough to the border that one of the cousins used to drive across the border to the Ukraine to buy gas because it was cheaper over there.
Right.
That's why I'm saying, they had relationships across, and other people in that same area had relationships across the border. And I'm thinking these friendships and this community between them is a source of hope for the people in Ukraine at the moment.
I'm sure you're right, Eleanor. Thank you. That's a great word. Philip Yancey is another writer that I've read over the years, and he said
Yep.
for a long time, he just keep asking himself, why is there so much evil in the world? He said one day it was like the Spirit came on him and said, Philip, that's a good question, and it's a question you need to think about, but there's a second question you're missing. Why is there good in the world? You know, we try to account for evil, so we go, well, there it's the dictators and the potentates and all the mean people. Why is there good? And Yancey said that it's just as important for us to ask the question, why is there good, as the question, why is there evil? And one of the things, to the Wesleyan tradition, and then I'll stop, John Wesley believed in original righteousness before he believed in original sin. And you say, where did he get that? And he got it in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, because sin doesn't come in until chapter 3. It starts in Genesis 3, but it doesn't. There's 2 whole chapters full of stuff to think about. And the first story used the word good 7 times, and it was good, and it was good, and it was good. And so while we're asking the questions of evil, suffering, pain, death, destruction, Yancey says we've got to also say, why is there even good in the world? And part of what you just said, Ellen, is because there's some people just across the border who will look after you when your own country is falling apart. That's Mr. Rogers saying, always look for the helpers, because they're there somewhere. It doesn't eliminate the tragedy of evil, but it means that the whole story is not a story of evil.
Yeah, I think to Eleanor's point, I think Poland has taken in 5 million Ukrainian refugees, more than any other country there or here or anywhere. So, you know, you really do get the sense that they understand.
And that does conclude some of our cousins over there in Gosova.
I'm going to be the first in my 75 years of life to say that I'm way overdosed on evil. I think.
Yeah.
I mean, there's no reason why Putin needed to invade Ukraine. That's just that's a zero. But he did. And so when you see that, you say, that's wrong. That should never have happened. People are dying unnecessarily, starving unnecessarily. But there's also other things happening. And hope, I think, is born where the light is, even if it's only a flicker of light. C.S. Lewis said it once, he said, if you've ever seen $1 bill and you never see another one, you know that there's money somewhere. If all you ever saw was one real dollar bill, you'd know there was such a thing as money. Well, if all you see is one person who will take you into their home when you don't have a home, or will cook you a meal when you can't fix one for yourself, there's something real about that.
Thank you so much, Steve, for joining us tonight, for expounding on your book, and for offering us many words of hope.
Yeah, hope. And I do
this time.
I hope that you found it helpful.
Yes. So thank you so very much. Let's close with a word of prayer. Oh God, who gives us hope, thank you for the conversation this evening. Thank you for Steve and for Paul, and this book that has brought us together. Thank you for the light that we see in the world, in each other, and the good that you created. Thank you. We just say thank you. As we close out our time together this evening, give us rest. May we rest in the hope that we find in you. We pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ, and in the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you so very much. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for your time, Steve.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve.
Thank you. Bye-bye.